Hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back. It's another Red Pill Religion podcast. Red Pill Religion, and where amongst the things we say are that mysticism is found in all ancient religious traditions, and Christianity without mysticism is boring. And we're going to be talking about that thesis with the author of a new book called Roses for the Most High tonight. But before we begin, remember, if you like seeing this content, which is this type of content, which is not the usual fare you find in people talking about religion and spirituality and culture, please give us a like, give us a subscribe, and hit that bell. We're on a new channel, and we have a new attitude here on Red Pill Religion. Also, though, because we have been chased around and demonetized and censored, we're on our third channel. Remember, if this channel ever goes down, we are still going to other. We are still looking at other platforms. We're still backing up on BitChute. We are still hoping other things come through. But in these days of social media, you will always find us on redpillreligion.com. Redpillreligion.com, where every day we have new articles, new videos, new shows by us, by others. If you like to see this kind of work and want to see more of it, please hit the PayPal donation jar or the Bitcoin donation jar, or join us on Patreon. Or we are pleased to announce that we are now on Subscribestar. Now, because we haven't, we were waiting for more than a month to get approved by Subscribestar, so we seem to have been. So now that we have been, and it looks like Subscribestar is going forward, please do feel free to join us as a monthly member there. It would mean a lot to us. It would help us a lot, and we are going to take suggestions for what appropriate reward levels would look like for those of you who are regulars. But you'll certainly be invited to the Discord chat server. You'll certainly be able to get contact with me, no problem. So in the meantime, too, please find our work on gab.com, on minds.com, under Red Pill Religion. Look us up on Facebook at Red Pill Religion. Look us up on gab.com at Red Pill Religion. Look us up on minds.com at Red Pill Religion. And find us all these other places, too. We are continuing slowly but surely to grow and expand. Now, and by the way, links in the low bar. If you're a nerd who likes talking about nerd stuff, please feel free to come join our Discord chat room and hang out with us if you like to talk about history, philosophy, science, mysticism, and that sort of thing. So, joining me tonight is our old friend Eric, who's just going to kind of be my sidekick tonight. Say hello, Eric.
Hey, guys. What's up? Thanks for having me on, Max.
Good to have you on, Eric. And I'm pleased to say that we are joined now by Ronnie Smith to read his biography from his website, which is at plenusgratia.com. We'll put the link to that in the low bar, but it's PLENUSGRATIA, Plenus Gratia. And as his bio says, Ronnie Smith has traveled the world as a professional aviator, bringing a spiritual dimension to his writing through his inspiration. After many years flying in polar regions, he became the in-theater commander of Operation Deep Freeze, the Department of Defense logistics support of the U.S. Antarctic program from 2005 to 2008. I may have some questions about that. His poetry has appeared in the New York Times, the Wisconsin Review, the Evansville Review, amongst others. Ronnie's spiritually inspired installations express the path of the soul symbolically through the icons of human civilization. A student of the Christian mystical tradition of the Catholic faith, Ronnie's writings and paintings capture the esoteric truths of the universal Christian faith through their medium of archetypal and mystical symbol. Well, that is an impressive background here, Ronnie. Say hi to everybody, if you would, please.
I'm glad to be here, Max, and I really appreciate you having me on.
So, Ronnie, we're going to be talking about your book. Again, the link to that is in the low bar already. It'll be on redpillreligion.com, too. We're going to be talking about your book, Roses for the Most High, Poetry Celebrating the Mystical Christian Path. And I think an awful lot of people are unaware that there even is a mystical Christian path, although some are, or that it goes back quite some ways. Before we get into there, you were mentioning something Showtime, pre-show. I take it that you, like me, started out, well, you went through a long spiritual journey exploring different religious and mystical traditions before you became a Christian, right?
Well, no, actually, I was a Christian the entire time that I was studying all the world mystical traditions.
Oh, I see. But you were studying them anyway. Were you participating in any of them, or what were you doing?
Yeah, I was part of meditation groups here and there, but I never gave up my affiliation with the Christian church.
Oh, okay. And I see you're Catholic. Were you always Catholic?
No, I was raised in a Protestant church. My father was Protestant. My mother was Catholic. And I guess my father won that argument. So we were raised, me, my brother and sister, were all raised through First Methodist. And then I eventually became, as an adult, an Episcopalian. And then I moved into Catholicism.
That's an interesting path, and not exactly a surprising one. I mean, you kind of walked backwards through history doing that, didn't you? For anybody that doesn't know, the Methodists more or less came out of a more, well, what you might today call a charismatic approach and a walking away from the institutional church. But they always, at least in the very beginning, kept a close ties to and contact with an Episcopalian bishop. So they were kind of like, they used to have the high church and low church Anglicanism, and then the Methodists kind of come out of that. Would that be a fair way of short summarizing it?
That sounds pretty accurate.
Right. And so then when you're wanting the more, as opposed to the more plain and humble, and there's nothing wrong with plain and humble, by the way, more plain and humble Methodist style. Usually when you go into Anglicanism, you're starting to look more Orthodox. You're starting to look more, frankly, you're starting to look more Catholic, but you're starting to look more Orthodox in general. We use the phrase little o Orthodox here a lot because we have a lot of friends who are from the, not just the Eastern Orthodox communion, but the, like the Assyrian Orthodox tradition and the Coptics and those sorts. And we're always welcoming to them, and they share an enormous amount with the Catholics, just of almost everything. And so we always mention them, and this book would probably be popular with a lot of them, and even some of the Anglicans. And so that's pretty cool, actually. And I think Taylor Marshall took a similar journey to you. But in any case, I kind of come from a similar background. I did eventually become Catholic, but I did not. I'm more Presbyterian and fundamentalist. But in any case, this is not about me. So you became Catholic, and what was it that drew you first to Anglicanism, and then Catholicism, if I could ask?
Well, when I was married, my wife, who was also Catholic, she and I needed to decide on a church, and I was flying in the Air Force, so she had more time to look around the neighborhood than I did because I was kind of out flying and on deployments and things like that. So I came home one day and she said, "Hey, there's a great Episcopalian church up the street. You want to go? You want to try it out? I've been there a few times while you were gone." And so we tried it and we liked it, and that's how that journey started. And so that was back in the early 1980s, right after we got married. And then my studying of meditation, Christian meditation, led into a deeper study of the world religions. And so I studied other types of meditation to see what they were like. And but you know, my first mystical experience in meditation was at my university, where I went to where I got my 4-year degree, which was a Catholic university in Baltimore, Maryland, called Loyola University. And one of my Loyola University of Baltimore. Yep.
Oh, okay. Because I'm from Chicago, I thought. Okay.
Yeah, there's 4 of them. Yeah, there's one in Chicago, of course, one in New Orleans, and then Loyola Marymount out in the LA area. So anyway, Sister Vera, one of my favorite teachers, was one of my professors, and I took a course with her. And at the end of each class, she would take the class through a guided meditation. And in that, and during one of those classes, during one of those guided meditations, I had an experience where I came into contact with my own soul.
Mm.
And so I didn't even know what it was. And so she said, I said something to her afterwards, and at the very end of the course, I said, I had this experience, back in, like the fourth class, and I don't know what to do with that. And she said, don't worry, you may not practice meditation when you leave this class. It may take several years, but eventually you will come back to it, and then you'll find out what it is. But that was your highest good, is how she termed it. And
Really?
so, yeah, and so, I just kind of tucked all that away, and then went on. I was into different things. I was an athlete, and tried, playing basketball overseas in Europe for a couple of years. And then when I came back from that, and looking around for a job, and I thought, I need to go into the Air Force. And right before I was going into the Air Force, I had this spiritual conversion where I could not put down the Bible or any spiritual book, any Christian book that I picked up. I just devoured. And then I almost had second thoughts about going into the Air Force at that point. And I had already taken my physical, I had already taken my tests and everything. And I thought, I think maybe I want to be a priest now. And so I had this kind of tension. There was this kind of spiritual tension when I was 26 years old, going into the Air Force, and also having these, desiring to be a monastic or a priest. So that's kind of what inspired this road that took me to, here and now, and writing this book on all the mystical elements and all the mystical truth in the very beautiful Catholic religion.
Interesting. And then eventually you wound up going all the way, call it swimming the Tiber. You swam the Tiber. You arrived in Rome.
Actually, the priest who brought me formally brought me into the Catholic religion through confirmation, and my first communion told me, why do you want to be Catholic? And I said, well, a couple of years ago, we made rosary beads in a workshop, and I started praying the rosary to, with Mother Mary, and then I found myself wanting to consecrate my life to her, to Jesus and to her, and so he said, "Oh, you came in through the Marian window," and I had no idea what he was talking about. But then, like months later, I figured out what he really meant was, that through the rosary, through the Marian rosary, I came into the Catholic Church, and it was pretty fun.
Now, certain Christians just lost their minds on that one if they're listening to this, because of course they are very, very much convinced, a certain subset, actually just a very vocal minority, as it turns out, but there's a certain subset that are just very hostile to the Virgin Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mother, as Orthodox Christians of all types know her, including the Anglicans, by the way. And that's a very, very American thing, actually. I mean, it's a Protestant thing, but it's not as much of being anti the Virgin Mary or anti the idea that she has any special place in the cosmos is a very Protestant thing, but even some Protestants actually still have a great respect for her. Meanwhile, I will mention again, as I always do, that not just our Eastern Orthodox, but the Assyrian Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, who split away from Rome and Constantinople both 1,600 years ago, still have the same basic idea of Mary as the Queen of Heaven. And I'm going to go ahead and explain a little more of that, just because when we get into this book, but before we turn, let's get to this book of yours, Roses for the Most High. I seem to have lost my link to it. Doggone it, where the heck did it go? Roses for the Most High. You can find it on Amazon. I have a PDF of the book here, and I have spent some time with it. Roses for the Most High, Poetry Celebrating the Mystical Christian Path, with a couple of nice introductions. Let's go ahead and just start. We're not going to get to the issue of the Virgin Mary. We'll start with the mystic saints. And I see you dedicated it to Mary, the Queen Mother. That's awesome. Let's start with a little bit of a lesson too for anybody here who doesn't understand the role of the saints. Now, you are going to hear some people from various Protestant traditions claim things such as all living Christians are saints, and that there's no saints in heaven, or that talking about the saints in heaven doesn't work. Every single believing Christian is a saint. Simply put, most Christians who believe in the saints in heaven simply don't believe that it's way more complicated, that you might meet or become a real saint, which in the Greek means to be set aside. You might meet one in real life, but for the most part, anybody who's made it to heaven is a saint. And again, I will also mention, not just in the Catholic tradition, but in quite a few other Christian traditions, there is the Catholic tradition is called purgatory, this between state between heaven and hell. But actually, while other communions do not like the word purgatory, the majority of other Christians worldwide, including some Protestants, totally agree that while they don't like the word purgatory, or they don't like the specific concept there, but the vast majority of Christians actually do believe there is an intermittent step between heaven and hell, like what is called purgatory. So whether you accept the purgatory doctrine as espoused by Rome or not, if you're Catholic, of course you do, but it is wrong if you're coming from a fundamentalist tradition to say we all go to heaven or hell when we die immediately. That is not what most Orthodox Christians believe, just so people know. And the belief is that going back to the most ancient mystical traditions of Christianity, we can show this in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, and we can show it in the Bible if you're willing to look at it and see it the right way, that the saints are people who have made it to heaven. They've passed any earthly sins they've committed. Now they have moved out of that intermediate step that the Catholics call purgatory and made it to heaven. Some have gone straight there. There's a few ways that can happen. But it's generally agreed, especially with the Catholic tradition, that most people, even believing Christians, are not going to be going straight to heaven. That there will be time. There will be time between while we're waiting for that, getting prepared in some way. In any case, the belief is that if someone's in heaven, someone has made full sainthood and they've made it to heaven, they're in a higher state of existence, right? They're no longer bound by the laws of time and space like we are here now. Things like the laws of physics and that don't apply like they do here. And it's a much higher state. And there's biblical proofs for this. I'll give to anybody who wants to see it. But even in like Galatians and quite a few other parts of the Bible, it mentions things like we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, and we're united with all believers, both now and throughout time, and with those in heaven. That's where you even get phrases like there's the church. There's the church. I can't remember the church militant, the church suffering, and the church triumphant. And the church militant is here on earth. Church triumphant is up there in heaven. So for those of you in other traditions who just don't like calling dead people saints, well, we're going to be doing that because that's part of the Christian mystical tradition. It's 2,000 years old, and I would argue earlier. So your first chapter is devotion from the mystic saints. Now, where do the poems in this chapter come from, and why did you choose them?
Well, I basically wanted to show that historically the church has not only had these saints who had these vibrant mystical lives and vibrant mystical experiences, but that the church actually nurtured these men and women who practiced the mystical path. So most of it was to highlight just a few. I mean, because there's so many, you can't cover them all. But I just wanted to give a good rounding out of the depth of the mystical saints that the church has in her rich and interwoven history with culture and the church, and with the sacred orders that came about because of these saints who wanted to start a new order because of their mystical inspirations. One of those people, they're very popular. I can think of right off the bat. That's in this first chapter, is Saint Teresa of Avila, and the other one, of course, is her counterpart, who lived at the same time she did and was more or less co-partners with her in the Carmelite order in Spain, was Saint John of the Cross. So that's just two people that I wrote about in the first part, but it also includes about 15 poems. 13 of which are about saints, and then 2 are just about the maybe a saint's experience of a mystical life. So there's Saint Therese of Lisieux, there's the Venerable Maria of Agreda, Saint Joan of Arc, Saint Faustina, Saint Bridget of Sweden, Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Hildegard of Bingen. There's a sonnet to Saint Joan of Arc. There's a poem about Lady Julian of Norwich.
Okay, so these are not okay. That was catching me because I've always had a fascination with Joan of Arc and Julian of Norwich. But these would be poems not written by them, but about them, right?
Yes, these are all original poems by me about them.
Oh, by you? Okay.
Yes, I wrote all these, and so it's from, you could say it's from my mystical and prayerful inspiration, and to write about these blessed saints of our church.
Okay, so is this whole book of poems that you have written?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so when I read this thing on Thomas Aquinas, I'm not reading something by Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
I'm reading something, your poetry. Okay, I was making sure I understood that. Because I know that, like, for example, if we start with St. Thomas Aquinas, he has a reputation for being this Vulcan logic, almost completely dry philosopher, who's just ferocious in his logic and has no room for much anything else, right? That's just kind of his reputation. But you read some of the stuff that he wrote out or did or said outside of philosophy, and he seems to have actually been a pretty spiritual guy.
Yes.
I mean, he was definitely a priest and a friar, and he definitely had some mystical visions. That's for sure. So, like, if we were just to pick one poem, maybe out of this chapter on the mystical saints, on the mystic saints, do you have a particular favorite?
Well, they're all like little children. All these poems in this book are like little children to me. So it's really hard to pick out a favorite. But yeah, I mean, I could pick any one.
Could you now? Okay, well, to the Mystic Apostle, I assume that is about John?
Yes, it is. It is about St. John the Evangelist. Yes, the Apostle.
John, who wrote the Gospel according to John, and was tradition holds died at the island of Patmos, roughly the year 90. I think most sources seem to agree on that.
And more or less the author of the Revelation.
Let me just read it here. This is about the author of the Gospel of John and the Revelation, the Book of Revelations. Your exile launched my own, but not to your Isle of Patmos, not to visions beyond pillars of Hercules, where violent seas of silence obliterated the patter of gab without your door. I sojourn north and south to polar suns, where unrelenting mile is gladiator, and high-tech czars gnaw his coat of mail, for scavengers seek no savior to forage the garden of that ice-mad Armageddon. It took 2 millennia for me to read your words from the lips of God, yet I saw where God spoke at the axis of earth, in glistening crystalline forms that meditate in waves of frozen rapture. A ripple in the glory of eternity's crisis as life battles its own destroyer, a suicide to maintain absolute zero of eerie beauty, the spectacle of its serenity, stages in Colosseum of monochrome trinity. I don't quite understand all of that, but it's very beautiful. What is the reference to the Pillars of Hercules?
Okay, there's actually, if you turn the page, there's one more verse on it. If you don't mind, I'll just read it.
Mm-hmm.
A place to reside inside exile, where cloud upon cloud exalts and acclaims the plunder of tundra with ivory javelins of undying light, scattering gnomes that taste grit, ash of flesh, and smoke of fire. Okay.
Obviously, drawing on or pointing us to like the apocalyptic visions in the Revelation, amongst other things. But go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, the Pillars of Hercules. That's just a name for the Strait of Gibraltar.
Oh, really?
Yes. So that's an ancient name of the Straits of Gibraltar. So
where the island of Patmos is, or near it.
Right. So all I'm saying in that first verse there is that, even though his exile was in the Mediterranean, he went beyond the Mediterranean in his mystical visions.
That makes great sense to me. That
he
makes
went
great
into the
sense.
eternity of God to pull down, the revelations that he pulled down, and he went deep within the cavern of the heart to write the things that he wrote in the Gospel of John.
Which is a very, very deep, it is the most deep and spiritual of the Gospels. I would say almost everybody agrees with that. There's so much in the Gospel of John. It's not immediately apparent when you first read it. And so you say you sojourn north and south to polar suns. I take it that has to do with your days as an aviator.
Yes, in my aviation career in the Air Force, I was in the Air Force for roughly 30 years, and 25 of those years I was flying these airplanes, 4-engine airplanes called C-130s, transport airplanes. Now this one airplane that I flew for 25 years was very versatile. So for every kind of type of mission that the Air Force has, a particular type of C-130 was developed to execute that mission. So in the desert, in the jungles, on the polar ice caps, and then there's all kinds of C-130s that do combat missions and different other things, and communications missions and things like that. Even space support missions. They have C-130s that are highly that the only thing they have on them is scientific gear to help us deal with satellites and satellite retrieval and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But for 12 of those years, I was involved. 12 of those 25 flying years, I was involved in the United States' support of the United States science that takes place in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So in those two places, those are just two big polar deserts, and in those polar deserts, I had plenty of time not only just to see the beauty of creation, but to contemplate it. And and really, kind of gain a great appreciation for nature, because in those areas, nature is dominant. Most of humanity lives between lives in the temperate zones. That's where all the big cities are, and that's where most of us live. Actually near coastal areas, littoral areas. 70 to 80% of the population of the world lives in littoral areas near coasts. But my point is that there are so few people in the polar regions that you have a whole different appreciation of a place that you can't control. See, we can control. I'm sitting in my living room, you're sitting in your room. There's a heater on, you've got a temperature valve on the wall. You can get hot water when you want, all these things. We get in a car, the same thing. We control our environment to a very great extent. But in these areas of the polar environment where there is no development, there are no major cities, there are no major roadways, there is the least amount of pollution in the world is in these polar environments. And that's why the scientists love it there, because they can detect, their measurements there can detect things without having the interference of all the other stuff of that human culture that contributes to the environment. So it's a great place for scientists, but it's also a great place for mystics to contemplate, creation. So it was very inspiring, in short, very, very inspiring to work in those areas.
And then the C-130 is known as a kind of I mean, C-1, they're still flying. They're still flying. I don't want to make it all about the airplane, but I just want to point out these are planes that are often older than the pilots that are flying them, and they're kind of known as workhorse planes because they're not the fastest or the most,
right,
but you can do all kinds of versatile things with them, like run a bunch of scientific equipment and monitoring equipment and stuff like that. And so you'll typically, I imagine, would be spending hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours on the,
Absolutely, yeah. The missions usually in a wartime scenario, and in the Middle East or wherever we're flying, it's an all-day mission. It's not something where you kind of get up, go to the airplane, get on, fly a couple hours, and come back. It's usually going to 2 or 3 spots, picking people up, dropping paratroopers, doing all kinds of things, and it takes all day. And it's the same way in the polar environment. You can, you're transporting people, you're transporting, scientists, you're transporting equipment, you're transporting fuel. You are surveying places for future landings. You're retrieving. We had this one mission where they would send up this weather balloon that would measure all the meteorological data as it went up into space, and it would go up to like 80,000 feet, and then they had the scientists had a way to deflate it, and then so it would come back to Earth with all the equipment on it that measured what it was supposed to be measuring through the stratosphere and up to the ionosphere. And so we would have to track that thing, fly to it somewhere, where it would land in the Transantarctic Mountains, and go get it. So so there's some very unique missions in the Antarctic and in the Arctic. Not least of which is landing and taking off on ice and glaciers in a C-130.
And that's a long time to be in the air and thinking to yourself and meditating, whatever. I mean, whatever. And you probably have a long time. It's like being an air trucker, a truck driver in space or in the air almost. So that's interesting. Now I see that in here you've got one called Desert Mothers, Desert Fathers, or Desert Fathers, Desert Mothers. Now the Desert Fathers are another subject that a lot of Christians need to know more about. You have the Church Fathers, and then you have the Desert Fathers, which were the writings of the Desert Fathers are still revered and treasured as, you know, some of the greatest Christian mysticism ever. They were mostly men who chose to go out into the desert and live like hermits, almost like John the Baptist, with, you know, almost nothing, living a very, very, very spare Spartan life out there in the desert with only the minimum and just out there praying. And they wrote some magnificent stuff. You also mentioned something called the Desert Mothers here, though. And, you know, I don't hear much about the Desert Mothers, which were women who started various communities or did various types of work out there in the desert, too. What have you, just without getting too far into it, what have you found out about the women who were there in the same time period as what are known as the Desert Fathers?
Yeah, well, you know, they were in the monastic communities that formed out in the desert. We're talking, you know, Egypt and the Middle East, near Alexandria and other places. But, you know, you also had desert mothers who were anchorites. You know, they were anchor holds to churches. So some of these women lived as hermits, and then some of them lived, you know, just as the men did. And then some of them lived in community. So you had kind of this this female feminine monastic movement that was parallel with the male movement. And so, you know, the reason, quite frankly, the reason we don't hear or have not heard as much about the Desert Mothers is because the men wrote about the Desert Fathers, and they didn't include the women. And so it's only been recently that their path, their mystical journey, you know, is coming to light. But, you know, they were equally, you know, had equal contributions to the development of the monastic movement. The monastic movement came out of the desert religion, the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, because they were moving out of the cities. What happened was, you know, Christianity became the state religion in about 325 or so. In 313, Constantine said, okay, Christianity, as the emperor of the Roman Empire, he said, Christianity is no longer a crime. And then about 12 years later, in 323 to 325, he said, not only is Christianity no longer a crime, but it is the state religion. So once it became a state religion, you have these councils that were starting to were formed to bring the church together and to start agreeing on what, you know, the doctrine and the dogma and all those things. Well, along with this came the liturgy and the external, if you will, the external actions of the Holy Mass. And so, because a lot of times this was so strongly associated with the state, with the political arm, you had this movement that wanted to get away from all the external stuff of our religion, which wasn't bad. It just wasn't addressing that mystical core. So you had this movement of men and women that just started going out to the desert to live hermit-like lives. And you had so many living out in the desert at one point, at one point there was more people out in the desert than there were in the cities in Egypt and in the Middle East. So these communities got so large that they had to actually form into communities, and thus was born the monastic the monastic heritage of the church, of the Christian church. That's where it all started. So that's why the Desert Fathers and Desert Mothers are important, because they're the ones who started the whole monastic heritage that we have, the very rich monastic heritage that we have.
Well, I'll have to ask you to send me some links or other info on the Desert Mothers. I find myself a smidge skeptical, only because the church has such a rich history of influential women, you know, like, for example, people you mentioned, Julian of Norwich and Joan of Arc and Catherine of Alexandria, and so many very influential women. I'm surprised to hear that for some reason the Desert Mothers would be forgotten, but or overlooked, when usually women don't get overlooked. The church calendar of saints is just loaded with women, actually. But you know, it can happen. So I understand you may be working on a book on the subject of the Desert Mothers, right?
Yeah, hopefully that's about 2 books from now. I'm hoping to write a book on the Desert Fathers and Desert Mothers, which is why I only did an example of one poem, you know, honoring them in this book, because it's such a rich, you know, area of men and women that I think I can do a reasonable, you know, poetry book on their lives all by itself.
All right, so if we move on to chapter 2, you have again the big Megillah. not a very what's the word I'm looking for? Not a very pious phrasing, but the big Megillah, the mystical Blessed Mother. And I'm just for those of you who just aren't familiar with the Christian background, you know, on this show we don't just talk about religion here. So for anybody who just wants to understand it, the general understanding, and by the way, you don't get to debate us on this. You're allowed to have your opinion, but you don't get to debate it. You don't get to just declare us wrong. This is something the majority of Christians, including majority non-Catholic Christians, have believed for what, you know, since well before the schisms in the first few centuries. And the basic idea is that Mary, first, remember what I mentioned to everybody before, which is the belief that's been with Christians from the beginning, that, you know, the saints are alive in heaven, and we're surrounded by a cloud of these witnesses, and you know, we can ask them to, they can see us. They're unbound by the normal laws of time and space. They can see us, they can hear us if we want. If we ask them to pray for us, they will. And so what's in heaven is what's known as the heavenly host, which is all the saints in heaven, plus the angels in heaven. And Mary is considered, amongst many other things, the Queen of Heaven. If anybody wants to know why this is all not just biblical, but why it's all the way most Christians have seen it, not in the English-speaking world, not among your Bible fundamentalists, or those people who say, I just go by what's in the Bible, I don't go with the teachings of men kind of Christian. Most of them don't get this. But what's understood, again, not just by Catholics, is that, well, amongst other things, Christ is the King. And certainly there's not a good Bible thumper anywhere who will not agree Christ is King, right? So he's obviously the King of Heaven, and nobody would dispute that he's the King of Heaven, would they? All right, very good. Now, does heaven have a queen? And a lot of people are going to make the huge mistake of saying no, because Christ never married. And there is a problem with that line of reasoning, amongst which is that if you go ahead and check your Old Testament, and you go ahead and check contemporaneous historical sources in other cultures in the time when, like basically in what we call Old Testament times, the standard practice in that era among the Jews and the surrounding kingdoms was that a king, the queen, was never the king's wife. That's a much later innovation in history. So let me repeat, historically, the queen was never the wife of the king, or it would be very unusual and strange. The practice at that time, this is both biblical and, like I said, extra biblical, is that a king's mother was automatically the queen. You see this in several places. You even see it in the genealogies when they'll list who's a king and who's his mother. And they always did that because that's who the queen was the king's mother. Now, there's a lot of reasons why they did it that way. The main one being that it was common for a king to have multiple wives and concubines. And so you have you can have a fight over who's really the queen or who's really going to inherit the throne or any of that. But in the ancient Jewish system, this gets bypassed. His mother's the queen. And this makes the queen a much more interesting figure because the queen can't boss her son around, but she's the king's mom. And everybody respects the king's mom because they know that if you don't respect the king's mom, you're in trouble. You're going to be in big trouble. And consequently, too, if you get to be friends with the king's mom, i.e. the queen, this is very useful. It's good to having friends with the king is okay too, but when you're friends with the queen, his mom, that's different. And so it has been the standing Christian belief going back to the earliest ecumenical councils that Mary, as Christ's mother, is indeed the queen of heaven. I'm sorry if you're one of those people who say, I don't read that anywhere in the Bible. You have to read it, not just looking for the one verse that explains it to you. The idea that Mary is the queen of heaven, and therefore the queen of every saint in heaven. Because, like, really, who's going to be number two if it's not the queen? Right? I mean, any other saint is going to be lower than her because she's the queen. And Christians for 2,000 years have believed that you can ask for intercessory prayers and blessings from the saints, and that includes the Queen of Heaven, the mystic Blessed Mother. Who also, by the way, most Christians around history believe that Christ gave her to be our mother too when he said, behold your mother, to the Apostle John on the cross. Just giving you that background for anybody who's sitting there going, I don't get this Mary stuff. Well, there, take some notes, and if anybody wants, I'll send you references later. So you did a whole a whole chapter for the Blessed Mother, I see.
Yes, Max, I did. And the reason for that is not only because she is one of the key figures in the whole gospel, even though she is not written about explicitly, behind the scenes. She was, connected to her son all the way to the cross and through his resurrection. So, the church, in its wisdom, has had many devotions, approved devotions to Mother Mary, and devotions that really cover the gamut of human experience. I mean, there's devotions that are included with Mother Mary through her sorrows and through her virtues, and so on and so on. So it's such a rich treasure house of what is available to a Christian and especially a Catholic through Mother Mary, that I thought it was very easy for me to write about a poem about her virtues. It was very easy for me to write about her as being the mother of the world and the mother of all people, of all the children of God. It was very easy for me to write about her 7 sorrows, and it was easy for me to write about my closeness to her and the mystery involved in praying the rosary with her every day. It was easy to write a canticle of the joy of love for her.
You wrote a canticle. That's pretty cool. I'll see if I can find that. Is it listed as a canticle in here?
Yeah, should be on page 42.
I have it here. And you and I share a special devotion to the Blessed Virgin. We do. Anybody who knows me knows I do. She took me to Christ. She did. Sorry, she just did. and I love her every day. But the main thing to understand here is that the Christian who has developed a relationship with Mary has developed a relationship with his spiritual mother, and that's very powerful. And for anybody who doesn't get it, what this means is that when Christ made Mary our mother, because he did, Christ made himself our brother. Which, when people talk about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, I like to say, well, he's my brother, because he is. That's the relationship God set. God is the Father. God the Father is the Father. The Holy Spirit is, well, many things, but love, and the Son is our brother. And so that's how that whole mystical thing with Mary begins, really, because she's the daughter of God the Father. She was impregnated by the Holy Spirit, and she gave birth to the Son. So she has that relationship to God as mother, as spouse, as daughter, and that role, she's basic, and she is the Queen of Heaven and the mother of us all. And so Christians who've gotten into that relationship with her, which I certainly have, tend to find great depth there, especially if you come from a background, by the way, where you had bad relationships with your mother or a bad mother, which is, it happens. I'm not knocking mothers, but when you realize you have not just a father in heaven and not just a brother in heaven, but a mother in heaven, who, by the way, loves you just as much as she loves all her other children, and is a perfect mother, just like the Father is the perfect father and Jesus is the perfect brother, it tends to heal a lot of things spiritually inside you. That's just my testimony, but I've experienced this and witnessed it. So why don't you read this canticle to us, Ronnie?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It starts with a quote from the book of Nehemiah, and I'll just read that. It says, "For in the days of David and Asaph, long ago, there were leaders of singers for songs of praise and thanksgiving to God." That's in Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 46. And here's the poem. My canticle to God extols her love. Bewildering night affixes the wise. Divinity chooses to woo the dove. Unshakable faith I grip with no glove, so to wield her word that no sword defies. My canticle to God extols her love. To encounter the highest light thereof, my eagle of knowledge to ego dies. Divinity chooses to woo the dove. Compassion defends all the poor whereof captivity grows in poverty's guise. This canticle to God extols her love. The flight to paradise attests hereof. That wind on the sea lifts a cloud that flies. Divinity chooses to woo the dove. In tugging up slope with rope I can't shove is hope in the calming fire of her eyes. My canticle to God extols her love. Divinity chooses to woo the dove.
That is actually really beautiful. As a married guy, I like that. Divinity chooses to woo the dove. That is such a great line. That one might stick in my head. That's beautiful. And yeah, it's important to understand when you're talking about somebody like Mary. She gave birth to God. She's her mom. She's his mom. She loved him as a mother loves her infant, including her suckling infant, her child. She loves him just as much, and she loves God that way. And she loves God the Holy Spirit like a spouse. She loves God the Father as a father. So her love is very, very powerful. And she is loved, infinitely in all those capacities by God in return. So it's a very deep and mystical relationship. We're running a little low on time, so I'm going to say if we can move to the final chapter, which is Rose for, what is it called? The last chapter?
The Mystic Path.
Mystic Path. And what do you call the Mystic Path?
Well, these are a collection of poems in this chapter of ways in which we come into contact or can come into contact with the mystical through the rites of the church, through the rituals of the church, through the blessing of holy water, through Lent, through prayer, through the incense, through all these pieces and parts of what make up the rich liturgy and the rites and rituals of the church. There's a little bit of some poem about these things that kind of round out our experience in the church. Now, the point is that religion itself is not mystical, but it can bring us one of its purposes is to bring us, the people of God, to an encounter, a direct encounter with God. And that direct encounter, this is a very simple definition of mysticism. That direct encounter with God is what mysticism is about.
That makes sense.
So when you are involved in, let's just say, a baptism, and the priest says the prayers over the newly baptized and sprinkles the water and makes the sign of the cross over the child, or it could be a grown person. All those things are mystical actions. They are mystical words. They've been kept in the church for 2,000 years for a reason, because what they are doing is invoking the Holy Spirit. They're invoking God the Father, and they're invoking Jesus Christ into that event in which we are involved. And so if we can shut out everything that we bring inside, that we bring inside from the outside, from everything else in our lives, and dive into an event like this that goes on every single day in the church, in the Holy Mass, in the rites and rituals, in adoration, in benediction, in all these in wedding, in holy matrimony, any kind of sacrament that is taking place. We have the opportunity to have a mystical experience, a direct encounter with God. And so that's what this last chapter is about. More or less from A to Z, from praying to penitential prayers during Lent, and then Advent and Easter, sprinkling of holy water, all those things that can bring us into a direct encounter with God. That's what I've written about in this last chapter.
Yeah, I would mention this is what prayer beads are for, like the rosary, although that's not the only kind of prayer beads you can use. This is what incense is for, holy incense. It's biblical, by the way. Holy oils, holy water. Actually, the Catholics and the other Orthodox all have all that going on, because Christianity is really mystical. And it does make me sad sometimes. People just in certain Protestant traditions throw it all out, say it's all garbage, it's all accretions, and it's like, all these thousands of years of practice by Christians, by believers in Christ, and you're just going to throw it all out as wrong because you read the Bible different? I think even if you're going to stay Protestant, you want to learn about this stuff, because really, Christians do these rites and rituals for a reason. They have power, they have meaning, and they do tend to draw us closer to God. Now we have to be open to it, right? We can just sit there like kids and go, whatever, that was boring. Look at all them doing that mumbo jumbo. But it's all a very deep form of prayer, and it's all a deep attempt to get closer to God. And the more or to touch the divine, the angels, the saints in heaven, God himself, these are all efforts to get a glimpse of heaven. to get closer to God just a little bit before we die. And why don't we we're running a little long, but I've enjoyed the conversation. Why don't we look at just one from the last chapter, and why don't you read Ritual to us, and we'll talk about that one.
Okay.
Since we're talking about rituals.
Okay. Oh, okay. This poem called Ritual is it tries to capture what inspired me to write this was first of all our legacy, the legacy of the church is deeply founded on rituals from the very first church fathers, from the apostles, from Jesus Christ when he established at the Last Supper, when he established Holy Communion as a sacrament. So rituals pervade our religion, and it also pervades, if it's true in our religion, it's true everywhere else. So if the foundation of a church, the way a church goes about it's leading people on the path of God through ritual. The ritual exists in creation, and so it was that marriage of ritual in creation and the ritual in my life and in my heart and in my religion that spawned this poem. And it starts with, "My cocoon carried me, airborne with all creation, to my lyrical festival of birth, where I awoke to warm hands and lips that sealed me within unbroken life. I gurgled with the cool waters that poured over me, for eternity spoke little else about the origin of rain after its rising, flying, and falling. For no matter how we open our ears to words evoked by nature's gestures that silence even angels, we'll still see lightning strokes like a cat o' nine tails that shake every subtle world. I lost my breath to the Arctic turn, flying to the brink of earth, where I tucked under the wings of the maestro of air, quickened by currents gliding the blue. We were carried by all creation to seasons of one day and one night, and through a frozen portal where many are left standing and left still. We saw snows which bathe in the rhythms of white rivers for millions of years. This is how we heard its words, chanted in canticles that know only purity. My teepee is a silhouette of 3 bare trees who stretch strong, angular arms at dawn, inhale their shadows at noon, and vanish on moonless nights. They walk through the forest's aboriginal fog. This sleepless journey begins and ends in mystery when the curtain falls and lifts freely. The daylight finds them glistened, dripping minuscule sounds that spill a universe. We hear their words. They'll be carried in an ark by me, airborne with all creation, to my lyrical festival of death."
Holy cow, I apologize. I was talking and I was not unmuted. I apologize. Very unprofessional. That's very deep. It reminds me a lot about, I mean, I see a lot of reference there to your time as an aviator over the Arctic, of course. And I'm reminded of the revelation of John when you talk about the curtain falling and lifting. In fact, that's well, I don't want to get into it. So what were you trying to express through this poem?
Well, essentially, and thank you for your kind words, Max. Essentially, you know, no matter whether you are a religious person or not, there are rituals in this world that everyone must go through, and some of these rituals are very, very deep, and but we ignore them. And that first ritual that everyone has to go through is the ritual of birth, and that last ritual everyone has to go through is death. And so, you know, the spiritual reality of coming into this physical, dense physical world, and the physical reality of leaving it are two things that, you know, unless we're really, really close to death, we don't really, you know, ponder it a whole lot. I mean, most people start thinking about death when someone tells them, hey, you're almost ready to die. Or they get so old that they go, hey, I think maybe I am ready to die. And they might start thinking about death. So what I wanted to capture in this poem was the unavoidability of ritual. And so, you know, ritual, like I said before, like I was trying to say before, was that, you know, if ritual is true, I mean, if it's the truth, then, you know, it exists in more than one place. It exists, you know, everywhere. And so as you look at the stars, you know, the planets, the universe, everything's spinning, moving, traveling, and going through phases of ritual after ritual after ritual. And it comes into our spiritual life. The ritual is poured into our spiritual life through whatever religion you're in, whether you're in the Christian religion or a Buddhist or whatever it is. There is ritual in that path. And that's kind of what I wanted to bring out of this poem.
Yeah, I'm not gonna disagree with you at all on that, because I really do think there's a lot of people, especially in these highly secularized times when a lot of people are indoctrinated into atheism. I'm sorry, but they are. And a lot of people, they tend to psychologize, and so they tend to explain away rituals as just, you know, little meaningless fun things that people do somehow. But in fact, participating in rituals is like one of the most universal human behaviors there is. Maybe the most universal, actually. There's people who've looked at it. I mean, whether it's wedding ceremonies, graduation ceremonies, these are all rituals, by the way. Even birthday parties where you sit around a cake and blow the candles out and sing happy birthday. That, my friend, is a ritual. And it's not just a tradition, because I believe that virtually all rituals are pointing to something higher or lower, one of the two usually. You know, I mean, you can take place in dark rituals if you want. I've met people who have. Read quite a bit of it. And then there's positive rituals, and they are very normal to the human experience. And I think it's almost insane, and it's certainly abusive, to suggest that people who are using rituals are doing something wrong or psychotic or crazy. Sure, a ritual could be dangerous, but anything can be dangerous. Christian rituals are as deep and complex and subtle as Buddhist, at least as complex, subtle, and deep as Buddhist, Hindu, you name it, at least so. As a Christian, I'm going to call them superior, but whatever. Human beings indulge in ritual. They simply do. And I don't even like the word indulge, because they do it almost automatically. You'll even hear people who are atheists praying. You know, I mean, what are they saying? What are they talking about when they say, "Oh God, please, please, please"? What exactly? You know, because I need this to come in, please, please, please. You'll hear them doing that. Like, who are you praying to? Nobody. It's just they'll say, no, it's just a phrase. It's just a whatever. But it's like, this is really part of human nature. So even if you're in fact, one of the things that got me out of my own atheism was noticing through evolutionary psychology and anthropology and archaeology and quite a few other forms, you know, areas of science as well. I just noticed things like ritual and spirituality are universal in humans. They're everywhere in every society, where they aren't, you know, explicitly forbidden or expunged, like in China. And yet, even in places like China, these things don't go away anyway. No matter how much they kill people or torment people or torture them, people won't stop. And I just remember that being one of my big revelations. I'm like, this is natural behavior in human animals. They seem to get crazy and sick when they don't do it. Maybe there's something to it. That was actually kind of my beginning path out. So for anybody who is, and honestly, the rituals of Catholicism helped me enormously. The whole, sitting around, reading the Bible and yelling praise Jesus and jumping up and down and saying you've got the Holy Spirit in you. I don't say any of that's wrong, but I know I personally needed a more structured approach before any of it could make sense to me. It had to make and ritual and repetitive prayer and things like the rosary and other prayer beads and things like that were hugely helpful to me in my spiritual journey. They're tools that we have that we should use, is how I would put it. But I guess that's enough editorializing for me. I think it's about time we start closing up here. We've run a little long, but we've had a great conversation. We've been interviewing Ronnie Smith, a poet who's the author of Roses to the Most High, poetry celebrating the mystical Christian faith. Would there be anything else you'd like to tell us about your book or your upcoming books, Ronnie?
Well, I'm getting pretty close on finishing my next book, which will be on the Celtic mystics and saints. So I'm really looking forward to bringing that book out and exposing the deep spirituality of the Celtic peoples.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to hearing. Maybe we'll bring you on when you have that one up too. When you have that one out.
Thank you very much, man.
All right. So we have been interviewing Ronnie Smith, author of Roses for the Most High, poetry celebrating the mystical Christian path. Which is poets about ancient Christian mystics going back at least to the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, the earliest centuries of the Church, all the way through to fairly modern times. And quite a bit is very beautiful poetry. So check it out on Amazon. It is available in ebook publishing from other sources, not Amazon. We couldn't find the link before the show, but if Ronnie gets me a link, I'll make sure to get a link to an ebook source. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Tomorrow night, I'm actually not sure what we have going on. It's probably the Weekend Atheist Stupid with Jean-Baptiste. We have interviews planned for, we're here every night. And so we are probably going to be moving John C. Wright's night over to Monday or Tuesday. But in any case, we're here every night. And if you like the content we're doing here, please, which is not specifically Catholic, not even specifically Christian, because we bring in people of other religious faiths all the time here to talk about their stuff in a non-confrontational way. And if you like this kind of unique content, please support our work on redpillreligion.com. Hit that PayPal tip jar. Hit that Bitcoin. We really appreciate the Bitcoin these days. Patreon's there for those who still like it. And of course, we are now on Subscribestar. We would love for you to be, we'd like to see who our first Subscribestar patron is, because we'd really appreciate that. And otherwise, here on YouTube for now, please give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. Please tell your friends or enemies about us. And God bless everyone.